The letter hit the floorboards of the Hartwell Ranch house with a sound like a gunshot, and Olive Ellsworth's voice did not waver even as every nerve in her body screamed at her to run. "You made a promise," she said, standing in the open doorway with the June sun blazing at her back, her traveling dress caked in 3 days of trail dust, her green eyes fixed on the man who was most certainly not the man she had ridden 400 miles to find. "Your brother made a promise to me, and now he is dead, and I am standing on your doorstep with nothing but a letter, $32, and the deed to a piece of land that your family swore would be mine." Vernon Hartwell did not move. He stood 6 feet of lean, sun-hardened rancher in the center of his own kitchen, a coffee cup suspended halfway between the table and his mouth, dark eyes reading her face the way a man reads weather on the horizon, quickly, carefully, looking for what kind of storm was coming. "My brother," he said slowly, and something crossed his face that was not anger and not sorrow and not guilt, but was somehow all three braided together like a rope, made a great many promises he had no business making. "Then perhaps," Olive said, and she kept her chin level because she had promised herself on the long, brutal road from Abilene to this valley in the New Mexico territory that she would not cry, not in front of a stranger, not in front of anyone. "You could tell me which promises fall to you, and which ones I simply have to bury alongside him." The coffee cup came down on the table, hard. And that was how it began. Not with gentleness, not with sweetness, not with the fairy story version of a woman arriving at a ranch to claim a letter-written courtship and finding a man who was everything the letters had promised. It began with betrayal and grief, and a woman who had sold everything she owned in the world to travel across a continent on the word of a dead man, standing in the home of his brother and learning, in the space of a single conversation, that the secrets ran so much deeper than any letter had let on. Olive had grown up in Abilene, Kansas, though grown up was perhaps a generous description for what had happened to her. She had survived Abilene. Her father, Thomas Ellsworth, had been a dry goods merchant with an optimist's heart and a gambler's luck, which meant he had been wonderful company and catastrophically unreliable as a provider. He had died of fever in the winter of 1882, leaving Olive at 22 years old with the store's debts, a younger brother named Clem who was 17 and wild-hearted, and a mother who had gone so deep into her own grief that she had not spoken more than 10 words a day since February. The store had gone to the bank. The house had followed. Olive had taken a position as a seamstress with a widow named Mrs. Hargrove, and she had mended clothes and hemmed curtains and embroidered monograms onto handkerchiefs for 2 years, saving every cent that did not go toward feeding herself and Clem, and keeping her mother in the small boarding room they shared. And she had felt, every single day of those 2 years, the slow grinding pressure of a life that was closing in around her like a fist. The advertisement had appeared in the Abilene Chronicle in the spring of 1884. It had not been a mail-order bride advertisement. Not exactly, though Olive had seen enough of those to know their shape. It had been a land notice, or rather something dressed up as a land notice, written in the careful, slightly formal script of a man who was better educated than his circumstances suggested. His name was written at the bottom as Daniel Hartwell, New Mexico Territory, and he had described himself as a younger son with a claim to 30 acres of valley land that bordered his family's ranch, land he intended to develop as a homestead, and he was seeking a woman of practical nature and sound judgment who might be interested in a correspondence with a view toward partnership in that endeavor. Partnership. Not marriage, not right away. Partnership. That word had caught at something in Olive that nothing else had touched in 2 years. She had written back. The correspondence had lasted 7 months, and what had begun as practical letters about land surveys and crop yields and water rights had slowly, inevitably, become something warmer. Daniel Hartwell wrote beautifully. He was funny and self-deprecating and honest about his struggles, and he painted the Pecos Valley in language that made it sound like the most alive place on earth, red rock country that blazed in the afternoon light, cottonwoods along the river bending in the wind, horses running in wide open grassland that stretched to the horizon. He told her about his older brother Vernon, who ran the main ranch and was, in Daniel's words, the most stubbornly decent man alive, and about his father's death 2 years prior, and about how he had decided to claim his own corner of the world rather than spend his life in his brother's shadow. By October of 1884, Daniel had proposed. By November, Olive had accepted. By December, she had received a letter not from Daniel, but from a man named Caleb Pryor, who identified himself as the Hartwell family's lawyer in the town of Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, informing her with great regret that Daniel Hartwell had died of injuries sustained in a riding accident in late November, and that as per Daniel's written wishes, his claim to the 30 acres had been transferred to Miss Olive Ellsworth of Abilene, Kansas, and the relevant deed was enclosed. Olive had sat with that letter in her hands for a very long time. She had thought about staying. She had thought about selling the deed. She had thought about what it would mean to travel to a place where she knew no one, to claim land that was bordered on all sides by a ranch owned by a grieving family who had never met her, whose brother had made her a promise that had died with him. And then she had thought about the store that was gone and the house that was gone and the 2 years of hemming handkerchiefs, and she had thought about Clem, who had found steady work at a livery in Abilene, and who had her mother settled now, and who had looked at her when she told him about Daniel's death and said, quietly, "You do not have to stay here on account of us, Olive. You never did." She had packed her trunk. She had sold her sewing things. She had bought a ticket on the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad as far as Raton, and she had arranged a seat on the stage from there to Cimarron, and she had ridden the last 30 miles to the Hartwell Ranch on a rented horse from the livery at Cimarron, following the directions given to her by Caleb Pryor, who had met with her in his office the afternoon before, and who had, in the course of that meeting, told her something that changed the shape of everything she thought she understood. The 30 acres were hers, yes, but the 30 acres sat in the middle of a dispute. Daniel Hartwell had filed the claim, and the deed was legal, but there was a man named Silas Cutter who had been running cattle across that land for the past 3 years under an informal agreement with old Robert Hartwell, the father, and Silas Cutter was not the kind of man who responded to legal documents by simply moving his cattle and apologizing for the inconvenience. Silas Cutter was the kind of man who had 3 hired hands who carried guns and who had, on at least one occasion that Pryor knew of, persuaded a neighboring homesteader to abandon his claim by methods that were never formally investigated. Does Vernon Hartwell know about Cutter's arrangement on that land? Olive had asked. Pryor had folded his hands on his desk and looked at her with the expression of a man who is delivering information he would rather not be responsible for. "That," he had said, "is something you will have to ask Vernon Hartwell yourself," which was why she had ridden out in the morning, and why she had walked through that kitchen door, and why she was standing here now watching Vernon Hartwell set down his coffee cup with a crack that said more than any words had yet. "Sit down," he said. Not unkindly, but not gently either. Just directly, the way a man speaks when he is trying to figure out what the situation actually is before he decides how to feel about it. Olive sat. She laid Daniel's letters on the table. She laid the deed beside them. She did not remove her hat because she was not yet certain whether she was staying or whether she was going to be sent back down the road. Vernon pulled out the chair across from her and sat as well, and for a moment he simply looked at the papers on the table, and then he looked at her, and she looked back, and what she saw in his face was not what she had expected to find. She had expected hostility, or sorrow, or the particular kind of resentment that families often directed at people who arrived to remind them of their dead. She had expected, if she was honest, to be viewed as a problem. What she saw instead was exhaustion, and beneath the exhaustion something that looked very much like grief that had not yet had a proper chance to breathe. "Daniel never told me he wrote to you," Vernon said. "He may not have known how you would respond," Olive said carefully. A sound that was not quite a laugh moved through him. He knew exactly how I would have responded. He would have done it anyway. He picked up one of the letters, looked at the handwriting, and set it down. My brother was never in the habit of asking permission. He does not sound as though he was from these letters, Olive said, and then immediately felt the awkwardness of using the present tense for a dead man and amended. He did not sound as though he was. Vernon was quiet for a moment. He rode out at dawn on a day when I had told him the horses in that east pasture were skittish because we had wolves in the valley the night before. He wanted to check the fence line on the claim land. He said it would take 2 hours. A muscle worked in his jaw. It took 3 days to find him. The silence that settled between them was the kind that only grief produces, heavy and specific, the kind that holds the exact shape of the person who is no longer there to fill it. "I am sorry," Olive said. "I am truly sorry. I did not come here to make your grief worse. I came because he asked me to, because he made me a promise and I had built my plans on it, and when he died I had to decide whether to let those plans die with him or whether to honor what he asked." "What exactly did he ask?" Olive reached into the inner pocket of her traveling coat and removed the last letter, the one she had received 2 weeks before Daniel's death, the one where he had talked about spring planting and river water rights and the particular quality of light in the valley at sunrise. She opened it to the last paragraph and slid it across the table. Vernon read it. She watched his face as he did. The paragraph said, "I know the road from Kansas is long and uncertain, and I know you are a woman who does not make decisions lightly. But I believe in this place, and I believe in you, and I believe that whatever we build here will be worth the distance. Come in the spring, Olive. The land will be ready, and so will I." Vernon set the letter down very carefully, as though it were made of something fragile. "He loved this valley," Vernon said quietly. "He always did, even more than I did, which I would not have thought possible. He used to sit on that east ridge and just look out at it for hours." Olive waited. "The land is yours," Vernon said. "The deed is legal and I will not contest it. I want that to be the first thing I say to you so there is no confusion going forward about where I stand." Something in Olive's chest that had been locked for 3 days released, just slightly. "Thank you," she said. "However," Vernon said, and she felt the tension return, "there is a situation with that land that you need to understand before you make any decisions about what to do with it." "Sela's cutter," Olive said. Vernon's eyes sharpened. "Pryor told you. He told me enough." Vernon leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, and in the morning light coming through the kitchen window, she saw him clearly for the first time. A man in his early 30s, she guessed, dark-haired and weathered in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors, with a straight jaw and hands that were rough with work and eyes that were the particular shade of dark brown that was almost black. He was not a handsome man in the way of portraits or illustrations, but he was the kind of man whose face held genuine character, lines earned honestly by weather and worry and hard work and loss. "Cutter ran cattle across that land under an agreement with my father," Vernon said. "My father never put it in writing, which means it is not legally binding, but Cutter does not tend to be persuaded by legal arguments. He has been grazing that land for 3 years and he considers it his by right of use." "It is not his by right of use," Olive said. "The deed is clear." "I know that, you know that. Cutter doesn't care." "Then what do you suggest?" Vernon was quiet for a moment and she could see him thinking, working through something, and she had the sense of a man who was careful with his words, who did not say things he had not fully decided on. "I suggest you stay here," he said finally, "at the ranch, while we sort this out." Olive blinked. "Stay here. You just rode 400 miles. Your claim land has no structure on it yet and a hostile cattle operation running through its middle. It is June in the territory, which means it is going to be 90 degrees by noon, and there are rattlesnakes on every rock. I have a spare room and a cook fire, and I am not going to send a woman alone back down that road until we have established a clear situation." He said all of this in the same direct, matter-of-fact voice he had used for everything else, as though it were purely a logistical arrangement and not at all unusual. Daniel would not have wanted anything less. Olive looked at him for a long moment. She was 24 years old, and she had been taking care of herself and others for the better part of 2 years, and she did not generally accept charity. But she also recognized the difference between charity and practicality, and Vernon Hartwell was clearly a man who dealt in practicality. "All right," she said. "Thank you." The spare room was small and clean, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out east toward the ridge where Daniel had used to sit and look at the valley. Olive stood in front of that window for a long time that first evening, watching the last light turn the sky colors she had never seen over Kansas, deep orange and rose, and a kind of burning gold that made the red rock glow like coals. She thought about Daniel, who she had never met but whose voice she knew from 7 months of letters, and she thought about the 30 acres that were hers on paper and a battlefield in practice, and she thought about Vernon Hartwell in the kitchen below making coffee and not quite knowing what to do with her. She thought about the promise. Not just Daniel's promise, but the promise she had made to herself on the train heading south, watching the Kansas grassland give way to the rougher country of the territory, that she would not be afraid of this, that she would build something here, that she had not come 400 miles to be turned back by a man named Silas Cutter, or by grief, or by the 1,000 practical difficulties that waited between wanting a life and having one. She had not come this far to fail. The next morning, Vernon was up before the sun, which she discovered because she was also up before the sun, a habit formed by 2 years of early sewing work and not one she could simply abandon. She found him in the kitchen making coffee with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done the same task alone for a long time, and there was a moment when he turned to find her in the doorway where neither of them spoke, adjusting to the reality of not being alone in the house. "I can make biscuits," Olive said, "if you have flour." He had flour. She made biscuits. They ate breakfast at the kitchen table in the early light with the windows open and the cool morning air of the high valley coming through, and Vernon told her about the ranch, Hartwell Crossing. It was called 700 acres running cattle along the Pecos tributary that wound through the valley, built by his father over 20 years from a single homestead claim to one of the larger operations in the Northern Territory. "Your father built something significant," Olive said. "He did. He also made informal agreements with Silas Cutter that I would rather have done without." Vernon's tone was careful, neutral, but she heard the complicated thing beneath it. "Did you know about the arrangement when Daniel filed the claim on those 30 acres? "I knew Daniel filed the claim. I did not know the full shape of the Cutter situation until after Daniel died and Cutter came to see me." He paused. "Cutter came to see me 3 days after the funeral. 3 days. He came to tell me that with Daniel gone and the claim likely to be abandoned, he intended to formalize his grazing rights through the Territory Land Office. He assumed the claim would be abandoned. Everyone assumed the claim would be abandoned. No one knew about you." Olive thought about that. "And now that someone does know about me." "Now," Vernon said, "the situation is more complicated. And likely more unpleasant." The visit from Silas Cutter came 4 days after Olive arrived at Hartwell Crossing, and it came without warning, the way trouble in the territory generally did. Olive was in the east yard, helping the ranch hand, a weathered Mexican man named Esteban who had worked for the Hartwells for 15 years, mend a section of fence when she heard the horses. 3 riders coming up the main track at a pace that was not social but not quite hostile either, the middle pace of men who wanted to be seen as confident rather than threatening, while remaining the option of being both. Silas Cutter was not what she had imagined. She had imagined a large man, physically imposing, the kind of bully who announced himself with size. Cutter was of medium height, thin in the way of a whip, with a pale mustache and light eyes that moved over everything with an assessing quality she disliked immediately. He was probably 50, she guessed, with the lean, dry look of a man who had been in the territory a long time and had let it sand everything unnecessary off him. Vernon came out of the barn as the riders pulled up, and he stood in the yard with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his expression telling nothing. And Olive watched the exchange from 15 feet away, still holding the fence pliers. "Hartwell," Cutter said, not dismounting. "Heard you had company." "I have a guest," Vernon said. "What can I do for you, Silas?" Cutter's eyes moved to Olive with the deliberate slowness of a man making a point. This would be the woman from Kansas, then, the one with the Daniel deed. "Miss Ellsworth," Vernon said, and there was something in the way he said her name that placed her clearly in the category of people he would not have spoken about dismissively. "Miss Ellsworth." Cutter touched the brim of his hat without any warmth whatsoever. "I was sorry to hear about Daniel. Terrible thing." "Thank you," Olive said, and kept her voice level. "I expect you've come a long way," Cutter said. "A long way to find yourself in a complicated situation." "I have found it manageable so far," she said. Something flickered in Cutter's eyes that was not quite amusement. "A woman of optimism. I admire that." He looked back at Vernon. "I'm going to be direct, Hartwell. That land has been part of my grazing operation for 3 years. Your father understood the value of a cooperative arrangement. I'm hoping his son does too." "My father's cooperative arrangement was informal and unwritten," Vernon said. "It doesn't survive the legal transfer of the deed." "Legal transfer to a woman who had never set foot in the territory before last week," Cutter said, and his voice had not changed its tone at all, which somehow made it worse. "A woman with no homestead experience, no structures, no capital to develop the claim. Seems like the practical thing for everyone involved would be for her to sell me that deed at a fair price and go back to Kansas with something in her pocket." "That is not going to happen," Olive said. Cutter looked at her again. "Miss Ellsworth, I've been on that land for 3 years. I know every draw and rock face on it. I know where the water runs and where it doesn't. You'd be starting from nothing in a place that doesn't forgive inexperience." "Then I had better not be inexperienced long," she said. A pause. Cutter looked at Vernon. Vernon looked back at him. The 2 hired men behind Cutter were still and watching. "Think about it," Cutter said finally, and swung his horse around, and the 3 of them rode back down the track the way they had come. Esteban let out a slow breath beside her. "Señorita," he said quietly, "that man does not take no for an answer." "I noticed," Olive said, and went back to the fence. That evening, Vernon found her on the east porch in the blue hour after supper, when the heat had finally broken, and the valley had gone quiet except for the sound of the creek and the distant calling of nighthawks. She was reading one of Daniel's earlier letters, the ones from the previous summer when he had been full of plans and energy, and the particular brightness of a young man who believed he was building something. Vernon sat in the other chair without being invited, which she did not object to because it was his porch, and also because she had begun, in the 5 days she had been here, to find his presence less confrontational than she had initially expected. He was quiet in a way that was not oppressive. He did not fill silence with noise. "You didn't have to do that," he said, "with Cutter." "Someone had to," she said. "I was managing it." "You were being careful," she said. "There is a difference. Being careful with Silas Cutter might be wise, but it might also read as weakness, and I do not think weakness is something he responds to charitably." Vernon was quiet for a moment. "You might be right," he said, which she had the feeling was not something he said easily. "What do you actually know about him?" she asked. "The full picture, not what you told prior, not what you would tell me in a first conversation. The actual picture." Another pause. She waited. The nighthawks called. "He came here 12 years ago from Texas," Vernon said finally. "He was already running cattle then, but not his own cattle. He worked for a rancher named Beaumont, and Beaumont died, not of old age, and after Beaumont died, Cutter had a considerable portion of Beaumont's herd and a bill of sale that no one could quite verify, but no one could quite disprove either. He has been building his operation here since then. He is not a man who has ever been stopped by a legal document. Has he ever hurt anyone?" The silence was answer enough. "What happened to the homesteader Pryor mentioned?" she asked. "Decker," Vernon said. "He filed a claim 2 valleys over 5 years ago. His barn burned. Then his well went bad. Then someone cut his fence and his cattle wandered into Cutter's land. And when Decker went to retrieve them, there was a disagreement, and Decker went home with 2 broken ribs. He left the following week, and no one did anything about it. There is no sheriff in Cimarron with enough men or enough proof to take on Cutter. The territorial marshal is 100 miles away and occupied with things the government considers more pressing than a land dispute." Olive looked out at the valley, which was dark now except for the stars, and the stars in the territory were not like stars in Kansas. They were closer and more numerous and more absolute, a field of cold light that made the world feel both vast and intimate. "I am not leaving," she said. Vernon looked at her, and in the near dark she could not read his expression clearly, but she felt the weight of his attention. "I know," he said. "I want to be clear that I am not asking for your protection," she said. "I am not a woman who arrived here to be rescued. I arrived to claim what was promised to me and to build something on it, and I intend to do that." "I know that too," he said. "But I would accept a working partnership," she said, "if one were offered on fair terms." The silence stretched, and in it she heard something shift, something that was not yet defined but that had weight. "What kind of terms?" he asked. "Help with the land, access to your expertise with the territory and the water and the cattle and the practical things I don't know yet. In exchange, I will contribute labor and whatever I can learn and whatever I can offer that is useful. Not charity. Exchange." "And the Cutter problem? We handle it together," she said, "on the theory that a united front is harder to pressure than an isolated woman alone." Another pause. "On that theory," he said, and she heard something almost like dry humor in it, a thing she had begun to notice about him, that he had a quiet, very dry sense of the ridiculous that showed itself only obliquely. "You are probably correct." "Good," she said. "Then we have a working arrangement." "We have a working arrangement," he agreed. July came in hot and relentless. Olive had known Kansas summers and thought she understood heat, but the territory summer was a different animal. A dry, hammering heat that pressed down from the sky and radiated up from the red earth simultaneously, that dried your mouth and burned the back of your neck, and made every physical task feel like it was being done inside an oven. She learned quickly that you worked in the early morning and the late evening, and you rested in the worst of the midday hours, and you drank more water than you thought you could possibly need, and you wore your hat always. She learned other things too in those first weeks. She learned the land. Vernon took her out to the 30 acres on a morning in early July, riding side by side along the creek trail that wound through the cottonwoods, and she saw her claim land for the first time in person, rather than on the rough map Daniel had enclosed in one of his letters. It was a beautiful piece of ground. That was the first thing she thought. A long, narrow valley within the valley, with the creek running along its northern edge and a natural spring at the east end, an open grassland that would grow crops with the right irrigation, and the red rock ridgeline rising behind it to the west that caught the sun and turned it amber in the afternoons. Also had very obviously recent evidence of heavy cattle use, churned ground and trampled grass, and the remains of Cutter's fence posts along the southern boundary. "He is still running cattle through here," Olive said. "As of 3 days ago, yes." Vernon studied the damaged fence line. This was a deliberate message. "He pulled the posts out." "He pulled them out," she repeated, looking at the scattered posts, the deep hoof prints going right through what had been a marked boundary. "After we spoke to him." "The conversation in the yard made things clearer," Vernon said. He was looking at the fence with that particular careful expression. The one she was learning meant he was angry but was keeping it somewhere internal and useful rather than letting it blow outward. "He is testing us," she said. "He is testing you," Vernon corrected. "He is trying to determine whether you will be frightened, whether the first real demonstration of his willingness to disregard your deed will send you back to Pryor's office to sell. And if I don't sell, then he will escalate the demonstrations." She stood in the middle of her 30 acres in the July heat, and looked around at the churned earth and the downed fence and the creek glinting in the sun and the ridge blazing amber. And she felt something harden in her chest that was not anger exactly, but was something close to it, a kind of clear, cool determination that had nothing to do with stubbornness and everything to do with the fact that she had come too far and given up too much to be moved by a pale mustached man with light eyes who understood property only as something to be taken. "Then we don't give him the chance to escalate," she said. "We get ahead of him." Vernon looked at her. "What are you thinking?" "I am thinking about the water," she said. "Pryor told me that Cutter's main cattle operation is 2 miles south of here, and that his cattle use this land primarily because the spring on the east end of my property is the most reliable water source in this part of the valley during summer. If I establish use of that spring and make it clearly and visibly developed, it is harder for him to argue that this land is unused and abandoned." Vernon was quiet, thinking. "You would need to build a holding tank and run a channel from the spring to the north fence line to supply the kitchen garden you would presumably be establishing." "I would need help to build a holding tank," she said. "Yes," he said, "you would." They looked at each other in the July heat, and Olive felt something pass between them that was not yet named but that had the quality of something true, a recognition, maybe, of the kind of person the other actually was, underneath the careful surfaces they had both been maintaining since she walked through his kitchen door. "I can have Esteban and my other hand, Croft, out here by Monday," Vernon said. "I will be here with them," Olive said. They built the tank in 4 days. It was hot, physical work, digging and laying stone and mixing mortar in the heat, and Olive worked alongside Esteban and the other hand, Tom Croft, who was a broad-shouldered young man from Arkansas who was apparently constitutionally incapable of complaining about anything. Vernon came out each morning and worked with them until midday, when he would ride back to see to the main ranch, and he was not a man who directed from a distance. He dug alongside them, rolled stone alongside them, ate the lunch that Olive brought out in the canvas bag alongside them, and she watched him in those days with a growing sense of understanding that she had not expected. He was, as Daniel's letters had said, stubbornly decent. She had thought she understood what that meant. In practice, it meant something richer and more specific. It meant a man who was fair in every small, daily way that required no audience, who paid Esteban and Croft the same wage regardless of whether the work was hard or easy, who stopped in the heat of the afternoon to make sure the horses had water before he had any himself, who noticed when something was wrong and addressed it directly rather than letting it fester. It also meant that he was complicated in the way that decent people who have also been carrying grief and responsibility alone for a long time are complicated. He did not speak easily about himself. He asked questions and listened with genuine attention, but deflected personal questions with a smoothness that she recognized as deeply practiced. She understood that he had been alone in this house for at least 2 years, since his father's death and then his brother's, and that the aloneness had settled around him like a second skin. On the 3rd evening of the tank building, when Esteban and Croft had ridden back to the main ranch and Olive and Vernon were alone at the claim site packing the last of the tools, the sun going down behind the western ridge in a configuration of color so extravagant it looked theatrical, she asked him without planning to, "Do you get lonely here?" He was wrapping a length of rope and he did not stop the wrapping, but there was a pause in the rhythm of it. "I get used to it," he said. "That is not the same thing," she said. Another pause. "No," he said, "it is not the same thing." She let that sit. She had learned in the weeks she had been here that Vernon processed things in his own time and that pressing him produced only withdrawal. The patience required was different from any patience she had practiced before. It was an active patience, a willingness to be present without demanding. "My father left me this ranch," he said, coiling the rope with careful, even loops, "and along with the ranch he left me the understanding that it was my responsibility. All of it. The land, the cattle, the men who work here, the agreements he had made, the debts he had incurred, the expectations of the county. I was 28 when he died, and I had been running the working operation for 3 years already because his health had been declining. I knew how to do the work, but I was not prepared for the weight of being the only one. He set the coiled rope on the back of his horse, turned and looked at the tank they had built, already holding water, the creek sound gentle in the evening air. Daniel was supposed to be the free one, he said. He was the younger son. He was supposed to have the option to be reckless and bright and do things his own way. That was the bargain of it. I ran the ranch so he could be free. His voice stayed level, but she heard the careful construction in it, the architecture of control around something that had not finished breaking. And then he went and filed a claim and started writing letters to a woman in Kansas and made plans to build something on 30 acres beside the main ranch, which meant he was choosing to stay near instead of going far. And I thought that was the first thing he had done that I truly understood. Olive was very still. And then he went out alone to check a fence line when the horses were skittish, Vernon said, and I was not there. The evening had gone fully quiet. The stars were beginning to appear one by one in the darkening sky above the ridge. You could not have known, she said gently. I told him to wait, he said. I told him the horses were skittish. He was a grown man who made his own decision. He was my little brother. The words landed in the quiet evening and dissolved into it, and Olive did not try to answer them because there was no answer that would be sufficient. And she had learned enough about Vernon Hartwell by now to know that he did not want sufficient answers. He wanted honest presence. She walked to the edge of the holding tank and sat on the stone rim they had built around it, and she looked out at the valley in the last of the light. And after a moment Vernon came and sat beside her, not close, the appropriate distance of two people who are not yet certain what their proximity means but who have stopped pretending they are indifferent to each other. He wrote beautifully, she said. Your brother, I want you to know that. He wrote letters that made this valley feel like the most alive place in the world, and they made me feel, for the first time in 2 years of very hard practical living, that something good was possible. He did that. That was his gift. Vernon was looking at the valley. Yes, he said softly, it was. I am sorry you lost him, she said. And I am sorry I arrived on your doorstep and complicated your grief with my own practical problems. You did not complicate it, he said. You arrived and you were real, which was unexpected, and useful. Useful, she repeated with a slight arch of tone. He looked at her, and for the first time since she had arrived, she saw something in his face that was not carefully controlled, a flash of something warm and slightly embarrassed, as though he had not meant to let that out and had only just realized what it sounded like. I meant, he said, that having someone here who is clear, who is honest and direct and not afraid of the work, that is not something I have had here in a long time. Olive smiled, and it was the first real smile she had given since arriving, not the polite professional smile of a woman managing a difficult situation, but an actual smile, involuntary and warm. Useful, she said again, but this time without the arch. The edge of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something that would become one, she thought, if given enough time. August brought the legal challenge. Caleb Pryor rode out to Hartwell Crossing on a Wednesday morning with a formal notice from the Territory Land Office, triggered by a complaint filed by Sela's cutter, contesting the validity of the deed transfer on the grounds that Daniel Hartwell's claim had not been sufficiently established at the time of his death, and that the deed transfer to a non-resident with no demonstrated homestead intent was therefore void. It is not a strong case, Pryor said, sitting at Vernon's kitchen table with his papers spread before him and Olive and Vernon seated across from him. The deed transfer is legal. The language is clear. But Cutter has enough political connection to the Territory Land Office to get a formal hearing scheduled, and hearings cost time and money, and I suspect that is his actual strategy to make the legal defense expensive enough that it becomes easier to sell. When is the hearing? Vernon asked. September 15th, in Santa Fe. That is 6 weeks away, Olive said, and I am already on the land. The spring is developed. We have begun breaking ground for planting. All of which helps your case considerably, Pryor said. The demonstrated homestead intent is important. The fact that you are actively developing the claim rather than sitting on the deed is the strongest argument you have. What do you need from us? Vernon asked. Pryor looked at him for a moment. Testimony, yours specifically as the neighboring landowner and as a party with direct knowledge of your father's informal arrangement with Cutter and its limitations, and documentation of everything Miss Ellsworth has done on the land since her arrival. I have a log, Olive said. She had been keeping one since the second day, recording dates and work done and materials used, a habit from the seamstress days when she had kept meticulous records of every piece she completed. She had begun it because it seemed sensible and was now very glad she had. Excellent, Pryor said, with visible relief. After he left, Olive and Vernon sat for a while in the kitchen in the aftermath of the news, and she was aware that the situation had become more complicated and more expensive, and that the comfortable working rhythm of the past weeks had to shift now to accommodate a different kind of problem. I will cover the legal costs, Vernon said. No, Olive said immediately. It is not charity. It is an investment in a neighboring land claim that, if lost to Cutter, creates a problem for my own operation. That is a very practical framing, she said. It is also true, he said, and she could not argue with it, and so she accepted, though she told him she would repay him from the first return on the land once it was fully established, and he said very well, and they moved on. The weeks between August and September were full. The claim land was taking shape. The spring was working. The holding tank was full. The channel that ran to the kitchen garden was functioning, and the first section of garden was planted with the vegetables that Esteban said would come up fastest in the territory's summer beans and squash, and the hardy greens that did not mind the heat. There was a structure, a simple two-room building of adobe and timber that Vernon and Esteban and Croft had helped her raise in the second week of August, not finished by any measure but with 4 walls and a roof and a door that locked, which made it legally a dwelling, and therefore a homestead rather than a vacant claim. Olive slept in the dwelling 2 nights a week, by arrangement with Vernon, who objected to the single woman alone on the claim land aspect of this arrangement with considerable feeling, but ultimately acknowledged that it was necessary for the legal record. She found that she liked the claim land at night. She liked the particular silence of it, different from the ranch silence, emptier and more absolute. She lay on the narrow cot she had brought over from the spare room at Hartwell Crossing, and listened to the creek and the wind in the cottonwoods, and felt the peculiar specific satisfaction of being on her own land, even land that was disputed and unfinished, and not yet the thing it was going to be. She also, on those nights, thought about Vernon Hartwell in a way she had not planned on. The thinking had begun gradually, the way these things do, not announced but accumulating. A collection of small observations that had been building since July, since the fence and the holding tank and the evenings on the porch, since the conversation in the last light at the spring when he had told her about his brother, and she had told him about Daniel's letters. She had noticed the way he moved through his work, with a quiet economy that was its own kind of elegance. She had noticed his hands, rough and capable, the kind of hands that knew exactly what they were doing at all times. She had noticed the dry humor that showed itself occasionally, more frequently now than in those first days, a flash of genuine amusement behind the serious face. She had noticed that she was comfortable around him in a way she had not been comfortable around anyone in a very long time, and that this comfort was not merely the comfort of familiarity, but something more specific, the comfort of being genuinely seen. He knew who she was. Not the version she had written in letters to his brother, not the version she had presented on his doorstep, the actual version. The woman who got up at 5 in the morning and worked until her back ached and kept a log of every task and did not back down from Sela's cutter and was also, some evenings on the porch, so tired and so far from everything familiar that she sat in silence and just breathed, not pretending to be anything. He had seen all of that. and he was still there. And she thought, on those nights on the claim land with the creek running and the stars vast overhead, that she might be developing feelings that had nothing to do with Daniel's promise and everything to do with the man who was honoring it. She did not know what to do with that, so she kept it to herself and worked harder. The week before the Santa Fe hearing, Sila's cutter made his real move. It came on a Tuesday morning early, when the light was still gray and the ranch was just beginning to stir. Olive was at the claim land, having slept there the night before, and she woke to the sound of cattle, too many cattle, too close, the low, heavy sound of a large herd moving. She was dressed and out the door in 3 minutes, and she saw them coming down the draw from the south, at least 60 head, being driven at a deliberate pace through the southern boundary of her land, through the remains of the fence posts that had been pulled out in July and never replaced. There were 4 men driving them. She recognized 2 of Cutter's hands. The other 2 she did not know. She stood in the open doorway of the adobe dwelling and did not move as the cattle pushed through, and she counted the head and memorized the direction they were driven, and the faces of the men who drove them. And when they were through, and the sound of them had faded south, she went back inside and wrote everything down, time and date and number and names. And then she saddled her horse and rode hard to Hartwell Crossing. Vernon was already saddled when she arrived, which meant someone had seen the cattle and sent word, and there was something in his face when she rode up that was different from his usual careful expression. He was genuinely angry in a contained, cold way that was somehow more serious than if he had been shouting. "They ran cattle through your east garden," he said. "I know. I watched them do it. Cutter is trying to compromise the land record before the hearing." "I know that too," she said. "I wrote everything down." He looked at her for a moment, and she saw it again, that flash of warmth, of something that moved through his controlled expression like light through water. "We ride to Pryor today," he said. "Yes," she said. "And I want Esteban to come with us because he has been working that land since the beginning and his account carries weight." "Agreed." He called to Esteban, who was coming out of the barn, and in 10 minutes they were riding. Pryor received them in his Cimarron office with coffee and visible concern, and he listened to Olive's account and reviewed her log and took Esteban's statement. And by the end of the afternoon, he had drafted an affidavit documenting the trespass and filed it with the Territory Land Office as supplemental evidence for the September hearing. "This is actually," Pryor said slowly, looking over the documents, "in a perverse way helpful to your case. The fact that Cutter felt it necessary to make this demonstration a week before the hearing suggests he is not confident of his legal position. A confident man does not resort to cattle driving through a contested garden." "He is trying to frighten me," Olive said. "Almost certainly. It is not working." Pryor looked at her over his spectacles with an expression that was part admiration and part sympathy. "I know," he said. "That is also helpful." They rode back to Hartwell Crossing in the long afternoon light, and on the road, somewhere between Cimarron and the valley, Vernon said something he had not said before. "I did not understand when you arrived," he said, watching the road ahead, "what kind of person you were. I saw a woman who had come on the basis of letters from a man she had never met, and I thought you were perhaps desperate, or romanticizing, or without enough information to understand what you were walking into. Olive lit that land, and now I understand that you came because it was the right decision based on the information you had, and that once you got here and found the information was more complicated than expected, you revised your approach without losing your direction." He paused. "That is not a quality I see often." "You are describing it very practically," she said. "I describe most things practically," he said. "I have noticed." A beat. "The horses moved through the afternoon." "It is not the only thing I notice," he said, and there was something so careful and deliberate in the way he said it that she understood exactly what he meant. She looked at him, and he was looking at the road, and the tips of his ears were very slightly darker than the rest of his face, which she found, unexpectedly and enormously, endearing. "I notice things too," she said, equally careful. He looked at her then. And whatever it was that had been building since July, since the holding tank and the evening on the porch and the nights on the claim land thinking thoughts she had kept to herself, that thing was visible now between them, named without being named, understood without being declared. They did not say anything else. They rode the rest of the way home in a silence that was entirely different from all the previous silences. The Santa Fe hearing was on September 15th, and they rode south together on the 14th, arriving in Santa Fe in the evening after a long day on the road. Pryor had arranged lodging, a hotel near the plaza for Olive and Vernon, a boarding house for himself. Santa Fe was unlike anything Olive had seen in the territory, older and more complex than she had imagined. The adobe buildings of the old Spanish town mixed with newer American construction. The plaza busy with a combination of people that made her feel the full weight of where she was, the deep, layered history of a place where several worlds had met and negotiated and sometimes clashed over centuries. They ate dinner at the hotel that evening, just the two of them at a table in the corner of the dining room with the lamp between them, and it was the first time since she had arrived that they had sat at a table in a setting that was not his kitchen or the claim land, and something about the formality of it, the tablecloth and the lamp and the distant music from somewhere on the plaza, made the space between them feel different. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" he asked. "A little," she admitted. "Not about the legal case. Pryor has it well prepared, but I have been thinking about what it means if we win. What it means if you win." "What it means," she said, looking at the lamp rather than him because she was about to say something honest and it was easier to start not quite looking at him. "For the shape of things going forward, between your land and my land, between you and me." Silence. She made herself look at him. His face was open in a way she had not seen it before, the careful construction temporarily suspended, and what was underneath it was something direct and unguarded and warm. "I have been thinking about that also," he said. "And what have you concluded?" "I have concluded," he said, and reached across the table and put his hand over hers, a deliberate and careful gesture that was also entirely unhesitating, "that whatever the arrangement is going forward, I would like it to be more than a working partnership." Olive looked at his hand over hers, large and rough and warm, and thought about Daniel's letters and the promise she had come to claim and how strange it was that the thing she had found was not the thing she had come for but was somehow more true than what she had expected. "So would I," she said. His hand tightened on hers. The lamp burned between them. Outside, the music continued on the Santa Fe Plaza, and the night was warm and the stars were out, and Olive Ellsworth, who had come 400 miles on a stranger's promise, held the hand of a man who was making a promise of his own. The hearing the next morning lasted 3 hours. The territory land official, a careful man named Aldrich who wore a formal coat and kept meticulous notes, heard arguments from Pryor on behalf of Olive and from Cutter's lawyer, a man named Mercer who was polished and expensive, and who made the case for the informal grazing arrangement with considerable skill. But Pryor had the log. He had Esteban's testimony. He had the affidavit documenting the September trespass. He had Vernon's testimony about the limitations of the informal arrangement with his father, given directly and clearly, and without any hesitation, which carried substantial weight as the landowning party with direct knowledge of the situation. And Olive herself was called to speak, and she spoke about the spring and the holding tank and the garden and the dwelling, and she produced the log with every date and task recorded in her neat, precise hand. And when Aldrich asked her directly whether she intended to maintain and develop the claim as a homestead, she looked at him without blinking and said, "I have invested everything I have in this land. I have no intention of going anywhere." Aldrich recessed for 30 minutes and returned with his ruling. The deed transfer was valid. The claim was legally established as an active homestead. Cutter's challenge was denied. The Territory Land Office would register the claim in Olive Ellsworth's name with full legal standing. Cutter's chair scraped back from the table. He stood, and he looked across the room at Olive, and his pale eyes were flat and still, and she met them without looking away, and after a moment he turned and walked out of the room with his lawyer behind him. Pryor exhaled loudly. Vernon was on his feet, and when Olive stood, he took 2 steps toward her and then stopped, remembering the formality of the setting, and she watched the restraint of it in his face and felt a warmth so deep it was almost painful. "Well done," he said quietly. "Well argued," she said, directing it at Pryor, who accepted the credit with visible pleasure. They rode north the next morning, back toward the valley, and the road felt different than it had coming down. Lighter. Like something that had been pressing down on everything had been lifted, not completely, because Cutter was still in the territory and still a man with a long memory and short tolerance for defeat, but the critical question had been answered. The land was hers. Legally, formally, registered and undeniable. They were 2 hours north of Santa Fe, in the high Piñon country, when Vernon pulled his horse alongside hers and said, "I want to ask you something properly." She looked at him. The sky was enormous and blue, the piñons fragrant in the morning sun. "The night before the hearing," he said, with the same careful deliberateness he applied to everything that actually mattered to him, "I told you I wanted more than a working partnership. I meant that entirely, and I want to be clear about what I mean by more." Olive's heart was doing something extremely undignified in her chest. "I am 32 years old," he said. "I have been running a ranch since I was 25 and alone in that house since I was 28, and I have not, in that time, met a person who made me feel," he paused, selecting the word with visible care, "less alone. Until you walked through my kitchen door with that deed and 3 days of trail dust and looked at me like I was a problem to be solved." She laughed, which was not the romantic response she would have chosen but was genuine, and she saw his face soften in that way it had begun to do more frequently around her. "I am asking you to marry me," he said. "Not because you are on my neighboring claim, and not because Daniel asked me to honor his promise, but because in 3 months you have shown me that you are the most," another careful pause, "most remarkable person I have had the privilege of knowing. And I am, as my brother apparently wrote to you, stubbornly decent enough to say so directly rather than hoping you figure it out." Olive looked at him for a long moment, this serious, careful, deeply good man on horseback in the Piñon country, and she thought about the woman who had sat in a boarding room in Abilene with a dead man's letter in her hands and decided to come anyway. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He reached across the space between their horses and took her face in both hands and kissed her, there in the Piñon country under the enormous blue sky, and it was nothing like the careful, proper manner he had maintained for 3 months. It was certain and warm and full of everything that had been accumulating since July, and Olive's horse shifted sideways slightly in protest, and she laughed against his mouth and he laughed too, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh fully, without restraint. And it was a good sound, deep and genuine and real. They were married in October in Cimarron at the small church on the main street, with Pryor as witness and Esteban and Croft present, and a small gathering of neighbors who had known the Hartwells for years, and who looked at Olive with curiosity and warmth, and a few of whom had known Daniel, and who came to her afterward with eyes that were bright and said things like he would have been very pleased about this, which she received with a full heart. She wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool, because she was a seamstress and she could, and Vernon wore his best coat and a string tie, and he looked at her when she walked into the church with an expression that she understood would sustain her through a great deal of difficulty in the years ahead. They exchanged vows in the presence of the small assembled witnesses and the afternoon light coming through the narrow church windows, and when the minister pronounced them, married, Vernon kissed her again with slightly more restraint than the Piñon country but no less warmth, and the small gathering applauded, and Esteban, who was the most composed of all of them, was seen to wipe his eyes very quickly with the back of his hand. Cutter remained in the territory. He had not made another formal move against the claim, but there was a cold awareness on all sides that he had not forgotten the hearing or forgiven the outcome. Vernon dealt with it in his characteristic way, not by ignoring it and not by confronting it unnecessarily, but by building the kind of quiet, documented strength that made any future challenge more difficult. He had conversations with the neighboring ranchers, including a man named Gallegos who had his own complicated history with Cutter, and by winter, there was an informal understanding between several operations in the valley that they were watching Cutter's activities and were prepared to document and report any further incidents. Cutter seemed to understand the shift. He pulled his cattle off the boundary of Olive's land, and he did not approach the spring. He was still there, still watching, but the specific pressure on her claim had eased, and Olive chose to interpret that as a practical victory while remaining clear-eyed about the fact that it was not a resolution. The claim land was transforming. By the end of October, the kitchen garden had produced a second planting of fall crops. The dwelling had a proper fireplace and 2 additional rooms framed in timber. And Olive had planted 12 fruit trees along the southern fence line, apples and pears, on the advice of Esteban, who said the valley would support them. She had also, with some of the last of her savings supplemented by the credit that came with being Vernon Hartwell's wife, acquired 2 milk cows and 4 chickens, which were not impressive but were a beginning. She and Vernon had an ongoing, good-natured negotiation about the relationship between the claim land and the main ranch, which came down to whether it was more sensible for Olive's operation to be formally incorporated into Hartwell Crossing as an extension of the main ranch, or whether it should be developed as a distinct homestead with its own identity. Vernon's instinct, which was the instinct of a man who ran a ranch the size of his, was toward consolidation. Olive's instinct, which was the instinct of a woman who had come 400 miles to have her own piece of the world, was toward independence. They were both right, in different ways, and the resolution they arrived at over several weeks of conversation and occasional genuine argument was that the claim land would be managed as a distinct operation. Olive's operation with shared resources and mutual support from the main ranch, but with its own character and direction. Vernon accepted this with better grace than she had expected, and she told him so. "I should not have expected anything less," she said, "given that you are stubbornly decent." "I am trying," he said gravely, "not to be a tyrant about the agricultural arrangements." "You are succeeding admirably," she said. He kissed her instead of answering, which was a technique he had developed for situations where he had no further practical argument. Winter in the New Mexico Territory high country was not the brutal northern winters Olive knew from Kansas, but it was cold and dry, and the snow came in December and lay on the red rock ridgeline in white caps that were beautiful and stark. She and Vernon spent those winter evenings in the main house by the fire, in a companionship that was easy and deep and spoke of 2 people who had genuinely chosen each other rather than simply arrived at each other by default. She wrote to Clem in January, a letter full of everything that had happened, and the letter she received back made her laugh out loud. Clem wrote that he had read the letter to their mother, and their mother had said, with the specificity she had apparently recovered along with her will to speak, that she had always known Olive would land on her feet in interesting terrain. He also wrote that he was thinking of coming west himself, once summer came, if there might be work near the territory. Olive wrote back immediately, "Come in April. The valley needs more good people." Spring arrived in the territory with a quality of light that Olive had been expecting, since Daniel had written about it in one of the earliest letters, but that still surprised her when it came, a clean, warm renewal, the cottonwoods going green along the creek, the grass coming up in the pastures, the sky a shade of blue that she had begun to think of as specifically belonging to this place. She was standing at the spring on the claim land on a morning in late March, watching the water come up clear and cold, when she knew. She knew the way the body knows things before the mind has finished formulating the question. She stood very still for a moment, hand on her stomach, not quite believing it and believing it completely. She told Vernon that evening at supper, in the plain, direct way she told him everything, and she watched the information move through his face. The first flash of shock, very brief, and then something that was so fully joy that it changed the whole shape of him, the careful reserve gone entirely, replaced by a brightness she had only seen in fragments before. He came around the table and pulled her up out of her chair and held her, and she felt his arms tight around her and his face pressed against her hair and the warmth of him that was by now the most familiar warmth in her world, and he did not say anything for a long time because he did not need to. "A boy," he said finally into her hair. "We do not know that," she said. "No," he agreed. "We don't a beat. I find I don't have a preference truly, only that it is well." "Only that," she echoed. Clem arrived in April as promised, riding into the valley on a rented horse with a pack behind the saddle and his mother seated in front of him. Because their mother, who had apparently made a full recovery of her will to engage with the world, had decided that if Olive was living in the territory and having a baby, then she was going to the territory, and that was the end of that discussion. Their mother, whose name was Ruth, was a small, sharp-eyed woman of 50 who had the slightly stunned look of a person who had recently returned to full consciousness after a long dream, and who proceeded to make herself immediately useful at Hartwell Crossing, in a way that initially flustered Vernon considerably, before he adjusted to the reality of another Ellsworth woman who knew her own mind. Clem, who was 19 now and built like his father, and possessed of the optimism their father had passed to all his children, took to the territory immediately. Vernon, after a week of watching him work, offered him a position at Hartwell Crossing, and Clem accepted with a wide grin and a handshake that turned into a brief hug, which Vernon endured with visible but good-natured surprise. The baby was born in November. A boy, as Vernon had half predicted, born at the end of a cold night with Olive's mother and the woman who served as the valley's midwife in attendance. Vernon pacing in the kitchen below with the kind of contained, carefully masked terror that was entirely at odds with his usual composure. When Esteban, who had been given the job of keeping him from wearing through the kitchen floor, finally heard the first cry from upstairs, Vernon sat down abruptly in the nearest chair and put his face in his hands. And Esteban, who had known the Hartwells for 15 years and was not generally demonstrative, put a hand on his shoulder and said nothing, because nothing was required. They named him Daniel Thomas Hartwell, Daniel for Vernon's brother and Thomas for Olive's father, both of them choosing to carry their dead forward into the living world they were building. He was a serious baby, with dark eyes like his father and a considering quality that made the ranch hands declare he had already assessed everything and found it acceptable, and he grew into a serious, cheerful child who followed his father through the work of the ranch with a quiet, attentive steadiness that made Vernon's expression, every time he looked at his son, completely unguarded. Sela's cutter left the territory in the winter of 1887. It was not dramatic. There was no final confrontation, no climactic scene. He simply went. The story that came back through the Cimarron community was that he had overextended his operation, that several of the informal arrangements he had been running had finally accumulated into a financial reckoning that made staying more costly than leaving. He sold his cattle to a Texas buyer and his main operation to a rancher from Colorado, and he went. And his departure was registered in the valley with relief that was quiet and deep. Vernon told Olive the news one morning over breakfast, simply, without ceremony, and she sat with it for a moment. "Is that finished then?" she asked. "Apparently it is," he said. "Good," she said, and went back to her coffee. Clem had by that point established himself so thoroughly in the Pecos Valley that he had claimed his own small homestead a mile east of Olive's 30 acres, with Vernon's help in filing the paperwork and Esteban's help in building the first structures. He was 22 by then and had found, in the way that people do in open country where the social geography is entirely different from what they grew up with, his own direction. He had begun helping Esteban with the horses, and Esteban, who had more knowledge of horse handling than Clem would have in a decade, had found in him a genuine student. Ruth had made her peace with the territory by the summer of 1887. She kept a room at Hartwell Crossing but spent her days mostly at Olive's claim land, which by then had the fruit trees producing their first small crop and a proper kitchen garden, and a section of the creek bank planted with the medicinal herbs she had always kept, and which, in the territory soil, grew with a vigor they had never managed in Kansas. She was at the claim land one afternoon when Olive found her there, standing in the orchard looking at the young apple trees with their first real fruit, and she looked at Olive with clear eyes and said, "Your father would have loved it here." "Yes," Olive said, "he would have. He would have made a dozen bad investments and found 4 new friends within a week and had opinions about the water rights that were enthusiastic but not quite accurate," Ruth said, and her eyes were warm, and she was laughing while she said it, and Olive put her arm around her mother's shoulders, and they stood together in the orchard in the October light. The second child came in the spring of 1888, a girl this time, born more easily than Daniel Thomas and with more of Olive's coloring, light-eyed and already vocal at 10 minutes old. They named her Clara Ruth, Clara because Olive had always loved the name, and Ruth for her grandmother, who held her for the first time with an expression of such complete happiness that Vernon, standing in the doorway watching, had to look away briefly. The claim land was not a claim anymore in any meaningful sense. It had become a homestead in the full original meaning of the word, a home, a working farm, a living place, with the dwelling expanded to a proper house of adobe with a timber porch that faced east toward the morning light, and the orchard coming into genuine production, and the garden serving the household through every season. Olive still kept her log. She had filled 3 books by 1888, careful records of everything planted and harvested and built and repaired, dates and weights and yields and costs, the accumulated evidence of what a person could make from a piece of red rock country and a promise. She read back through them sometimes, on winter evenings when the children were asleep and Vernon was reading at the other end of the table, and she thought about the woman who had sat on a train leaving Abilene and made herself not be afraid. That woman had come to claim a stranger's promise. And what she had found was Vernon Hartwell standing in his kitchen with his coffee cup suspended halfway to his mouth, dark eyes reading the weather of her arrival, and the promise he had made not stated outright, not written in any letter, not formalized until the road south of Santa Fe in the Pinon country, but present from the beginning in every practical, stubbornly decent act. Helping with the fence, building the tank, riding to Pryor, testifying at the hearing, standing beside her every step of the road from contested claim to home. A promise made not in words but in the steady, specific language of a man who showed up. On an evening in the autumn of 1888, Olive was sitting on the porch of the claim house watching the last light turn the ridge amber, and Vernon came and sat beside her the way he had that very first summer on his porch, close now, the appropriate distance having resolved itself entirely over 4 years into simply beside her, their shoulders touching, Daniel Thomas asleep inside and Clara Ruth asleep in his arms. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She looked out at the valley, which she knew now the way she knew her own hands, every curve of the creek, every rock face on the ridge, the quality of light in each season, the particular sound of the spring in the east meadow. She had come to this place as a stranger and it had become the most familiar ground in the world. "Daniel wrote me a letter once," she said, "where he described this valley at sunset. He said it looked like the world was on fire but nobody was afraid." Vernon was quiet, watching the ridge go amber. "He was right about this place," she said. "He was right that it was worth coming to." "Yes," Vernon said softly. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and Clara Ruth shifted gently in his arms without waking, and the light blazed on the ridge the way it always did in October, that particular burning gold that was not destruction but illumination. "Thank you," Olive said, "for making a promise, even if you didn't say it in so many words." Vernon looked at her with those dark, direct eyes and the warm, unguarded expression that still moved through her the same way it had on a road in the Piñon country the previous autumn. "It was not difficult," he said. "The only difficult part was being stubbornly decent about saying it." She laughed, and he kissed her temple, and the last light fell over the valley, over the claim land and the orchard and the spring and the two sleeping children, and over the life they had built together from a stranger's promise and a rancher's own. In the spring of 1890, Esteban retired from active ranch work at the age of 62, with a small house built for him on the Hartwell Crossing property, and a guarantee that he would be fed and cared for as long as he lived, which Vernon had offered before Esteban finished his first sentence about aging, and Esteban had accepted with dignity, and a look that said he had always known this man was worth 15 years of loyalty. Clem, who had been training under him for 3 years, took over the horse operation. Clem also, in the summer of 1890, came to Sunday dinner at the Claim House with a young woman named Beatrice, who was the daughter of the Gallegos family from the next valley, a dark-eyed, confident woman of 20 who had apparently been the subject of Clem's considerable interest for a year, and who regarded him with the affectionate exasperation of a person who found their feelings simultaneously obvious and inconvenient. Ruth, who was seated across the table from them, watched the two of them for approximately 10 minutes and then said, with her characteristic directness, "You should marry her, Clem. It is perfectly apparent to everyone in this room." Clem went crimson. Beatrice laughed. They were married in the fall of 1890, at the Gallegos family home in the next valley, with a celebration that included most of the community and music that went until midnight. And Olive danced with Vernon on the packed earth of the Gallegos' yard under lanterns strung through the cottonwoods, and felt the specific, irreplaceable joy of a life that had genuinely come together. Daniel Thomas, who was now 9 years old and serious as ever, stood at the edge of the dancing with his grandmother and observed the proceedings with the expression of someone taking notes. Clara Ruth, who was 2 and did not yet have opinions about dancing but had opinions about everything else, was asleep on Olive's shawl in the corner. Olive looked at all of this, her husband, her children, her mother, her brother and his new wife, the community that had gathered in the lantern-lit night, and felt, with a completeness that did not require description or analysis, that she was precisely where she was supposed to be, not because a letter had told her to come, not because a stranger's promise had pointed the way, but because she had come, and she had claimed her land, and she had been seen by a man who made a promise of his own, and they had built everything else together, stone by stone, season by season, in the Red Rock Valley where the light burned like the world was on fire and nobody was afraid. The valley held them all. The spring ran clear through every season. The orchard produced apples and pears each autumn in greater abundance than the one before, the log filled with another year's careful records. Vernon sat at the far end of the kitchen table in the evenings and read, and Daniel Thomas brought him questions about horses with the earnest frequency of a boy who had decided that his father was the primary authority on everything. And Clara Ruth climbed into her mother's lap without announcement and fell asleep there with the complete confidence of a child who has never doubted she is wanted. And Olive Ellsworth, who had become Olive Hartwell on an October afternoon in a Cimarron church 4 years prior, kept what she had come to claim, and more besides, and found that the more besides was the thing that mattered most.